Illuminating Hope, a podcast of Hope House, brings you Voices of Justice, a series of podcasts where law enforcement officials, judges, and advocates come together to unravel the entangled web of domestic violence. Join us as we dive into the complex challenges faced by those on the front lines of justice, exploring real-life stories, legal nuances, and the human side of these cases. In each episode, our guests share their experiences, insights, and perspectives, shedding light on the multifaceted nature of domestic violence. Tune in for a compelling journey into the criminal justice system, where compassion meets the pursuit of truth and where professionals strive to bring justice to those affected by the cycle of abuse. I'm your host, Tina Johnson, Community Partnership Manager, alongside my co-host, Marianne Matheny, CEO of Hope House, Eileen Sheehan, COO of Hope House, and Randa Hager, Director of Outreach Services. Welcome to Illuminating Hope, a podcast of Hope House. Chief Stacey Graves, a lifelong Kansas Citian, began her career at KCPD in 1997 as a civilian records clerk. After joining the police academy in December 1997, she held multiple assignments as police officer, including Central Patrol Division, East Patrol Division, the Drug Enforcement Unit, and the Career Criminal Section. Graves was promoted to sergeant in 2007, promoted to captain in 2014. In 2018, she was promoted to major. On December 15th, 2022, 25 years after starting the police academy, Graves was selected to be the chief. At 48 years of age, Graves became the 48th police chief in KCPD's 148th year history, and also became the first woman to serve as permanent chief. We are also joined by guest speaker, Operations Sergeant Maurice Oatis. The mission of Kansas City Police Department is to protect and serve with professionalism, honor, and integrity. Sergeant Oatis and Chief Graves, welcome to the Illuminating Hope podcast. Glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
I want to start off with you, Chief Graves, and I love in your bio that you started out as a civilian clerk.
Yes.
In the administrative office. So talk to me about how you pursued your career and became the chief of the Kansas City Police Department.
Okay, well, if we're starting at when I was a civilian in the records unit, I'll tell you how that came across. I was a Kansas City kid, grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, went to college in Kansas City, Missouri, Penn Valley Community College, EMKC graduate. I was a biology major. Yeah, and God had another plan for me. He showed me in my grades in chemistry. So I heeded the word, and I was in the records unit, warrant services. So I heard a lot of the officers that were making arrests, they would call, and I would take the warrants out of the computer, and it sounded like they were having so much fun. So I got to know a couple of them, and it kind of happened. I was kind of led by the hand by my sergeant, or I think she was a captain then, I can't remember, but she's like, I'm going to introduce you to someone. And she walked me upstairs and introduced me to the sergeant of the human resources, and it was this kind of history from there. Coming up through the ranks, I never thought or saw myself as a chief of police, but when the opportunity presented itself, I admittedly was a little bit resistant at first, but I felt like I knew this organization, and I can speak for every chief that's come before me. When you get in this position, you just want to do what you can to make the organization better for the people that are coming behind you. I felt like there was a lot of things that I could do, that I could offer, and that I wanted to make happen. So it's been a blessing and a privilege to serve in this capacity.
I think it's wonderful that you're also the first female chief. Does that come into your daily interactions, or is that just like not a big deal for you anymore?
I think externally, well, I'm sure internally also, Sergeant Oatis might be able to speak to that. For me, it's just, I've always just worked hard at whatever assignment that I was in. Mm-hmm. And usually that opened up other opportunities. Coming into this position, I felt like, I just needed to do my best in this position. I don't think of myself, or I don't bring in my gender. It is brought to my attention sometimes, and I'm proud of the fact that I am the first female police chief at the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. I hope I leave a good legacy and represent represent female law enforcement in a positive way. So it's an honor to serve in this position.
Just being in the position that you're in, you can't be what you can't see. And so there are so many young ladies out there who may see you on television or see you somewhere. My daughter included, who I told you before, she's in law enforcement. She's a year into a communication officer. How do you balance the need for effective law enforcement with the importance of community engagement, like trust building, particularly in diverse communities? How do you go about doing that? I know you have a community impact department, and they work with youth and other programs. So talk to us a little bit about what you're doing there.
So our community engagement division, that's what their specialty is. They have community interaction officers that are assigned to each patrol division station. That's what they do all day, is go out, attend community meetings, really embody that community policing where you're problem solving together with your neighborhood stakeholders. We also have our crisis intervention team where they are trained in responding to mental health crises, and also they do a lot of follow-up and they do homeless outreach. We also work with obviously some community behavioral health liaisons. In addition to that, we have our social services, we have one social worker that is assigned to each patrol division station. Sometimes they'll jump in a police car and we will be right on scene with whatever's going on. There's been several times where there's been a violent act or a violent crime scene that a social worker is actually riding with an officer and is able to administer some kind of outreach or resources or assistance right there. They're kind of like a missing tool on the tool belt. We have some of those community engagement folks in schools for DARE, Resistance Against Gangs. I could go on and on about our community engagement division, but every officer should have that community interaction officer approach to policing. That is what we are here to do, and this has been a topic of conversation this week that I've talked about just a pinch. The amount of actual law enforcement that we do is small in comparison to a lot of the community outreach. Usually when we make a call for service, if somebody's in crisis, it's usually like there's been some systems failure prior to us getting involved and someone is just in crisis. Or maybe it is a violent act and someone is harming someone, but then you look at what that root cause is. Well, is that because of something else isn't what it should have been coming up? And so we are like the last resort. I want to make sure that our officers, and none of our officers know this, that when you approach these situations that you're going to meet people in their worst days. Show them grace, show them some love and support, and sometimes that support is you might be walking next to them in handcuffs. But there's a respectful way to do that, and I've been impressed by this younger generation of officers too. Obviously, I do have the opportunity to review some body-worn cameras of calls for service and whatnot that are brought to my attention, and I am taken aback by the patience and the restraint that our officers show.
One of the things when we've talked to other chiefs or other law enforcement, we do talk about that you're not social workers, that you often are put in the role of being somewhat of a social worker because of all of the things that you just identified. When did you decide to bring a social worker on? Is that something you guys have had for a while?
Under Chief Smith, he brought in a social worker for a pilot program.
Okay.
He made chief of police. That was at Central Patrol Division. He made chief of police, and soon after he made chief of police, I was the watch commander at Central Patrol Division, so I actually was put over coordinating that program. And in that, we added more, we call them social service specialists, because I do know that there's Missouri law for a title of social worker.
Right.
Some of our members do hold that, and some of them have other criteria that qualifies them for a social service specialist. So we grew that program to one at each patrol division station, and then by way of the budget, we requested those positions be funded outside of a contract and actually department positions. So they are department KCPD employees.
I think that's wonderful, because I do think that the whole experience around law enforcement can be, and especially when you're talking about domestic violence, it can be extremely volatile, and it can be, you have people at their, as you said, at their worst in this major crisis, and being able to have someone to help, that it's not quite so all falling on the law enforcement officer to do all of that. I know that you've had some interactions around domestic violence as being an officer and then now as a chief. Can you talk about maybe what experience, I know you've been involved with Rosebrook Center,
Yes.
and talk about as an officer or on the role prior to chief, what you were doing around domestic violence.
Every Kansas City, Missouri police officer is involved in domestic violence, and I say that because we respond to calls for service. I remember early on in my career when an arrest was mandated with or without the cooperation of a victim of domestic violence. I do remember that coming into play and saying, hey, whoever the victim is, usually, ma'am, I'm going to arrest him. And sometimes they're like, well, I don't want to prosecute. I'm like, that's in our hands. And I do remember that being a powerful moment, really being able to help people, even if it was just for the night, taking someone into custody, making sure someone is held accountable for their actions in those situations. So I have had the opportunity to bring domestic violence victims to shelters, to assistance, to outreach, but throughout my career working with our social services at Kansas City, Missouri Police Department, I've also had the privilege of serving on the board at Rosebrooks, which that opened my eyes to a lot of the funding and a lot of the ongoings and what it takes to really provide a great service. But in addition to that, the lethality assessment program has, remember standing on the other side of the camera when those announcements were made that we were doing the lethality assessment program, and just being a sergeant, being a commander over officers that were administering that and making sure that they were connecting victims on the phone, like, hey, call them on the phone, and then hand the person the phone so they can talk to somebody that could safety plan with them. Been in a bunch of different stages, I guess.
Lethality assessment program is one of those that I'm just so proud of our community. So I know that Kansas City was part of the pilot project, and then several of the communities in Eastern Jackson County were part of that. And I remember going to those trainings, and they were talking about the numbers that we could expect, and this was done. There were 5 sites that were selected as this pilot project for this, and they were preparing, and I don't know if you remember that, but they were expecting just a few calls a week. The numbers blew people away, especially in Kansas City. The Eastern Jackson County are smaller municipalities, but even the smaller ones were seeing these record numbers, and not only just record numbers of responses, but of high lethality. And I think even the trainers were, when we would come back, because it was a pilot project, so we would come back and report these numbers, they were just stunned at how many people in our community were coming in as high lethality. And I know for Rosebrooks that the numbers are just astronomical. You guys are still doing that.
Yes.
And do you are still finding the numbers to be that high and really record numbers calling?
Yes, we still are experiencing high numbers of calling and services provided. What's unfortunate is that we also keep track of the homicides that are domestic violence related. And right now we have 5 here in Kansas City. And I think last year it may have been over 20. I don't want to throw out a number, but just because I might be confusing that with another category. But we have too many homicides. I do know that Rosebrooks was involved in getting other domestic violence organizations together for fatality review sessions, where you basically look at a homicide case and you look back and where could we have intervened, whether that be law enforcement, whether that be provider, like where could we have intervened to have prevented this homicide. Right. So the lethality assessment program is real. I truly believe that saved lives. Some of that's hard to quantify, right, because you don't know what may have happened if someone would have stayed, or if someone wouldn't have been provided shelter or even a safety plan to go somewhere else, and even a ride in a police car to a friend's house to remove you from that situation. That
is hard to quantify that, but I know that when we first started this project, they were only about 3% of the people who were killed had availed themselves to services. So we know that intervening at that level is definitely making a difference. I have also talked with law enforcement around what their thoughts were about that tool, all across the board, saying that tool allowed them to have the words and the something concrete that they could say to that victim, that because the officers were already experiencing fear and like, okay, if you don't do something, you're going to end up dead, not having the words to say that or the research behind it. I think that's what, so the tool is research based, so they had the words to say, look, I'm very concerned for your safety. If you stay, this research shows you will die. It's very powerful for someone to have that research behind that, to be able to say that to a victim. So
and as a patrol officer, having that mechanism right here on a piece of paper, it's one thing if I meet you on a day where you are in crisis, you've just been assaulted, seriously assaulted, threatened, for me to say, hey, your life is in danger. But if I ask you a question, if I ask you a series of questions on that lethality assessment, and you answer so many, that's for me to show, look, you have answered this many. This is telling you your life is in danger. These are the signs. There's a little bit of magic behind that. Even if someone doesn't take those services right then, they know that those services are available, and that's in the back of their mind. And when they're ready, when they have the ability to act on that, they know that that's there waiting for them.
Somebody makes that call for them. That officer is making the call to the hotline and saying, this person wants to talk. They really want to talk to you. You don't have to leave. You don't have, but they can give you resources. They can help you. And then the follow-up with them in 24, 48 hours later, just check in. can be life-saving.
Yes, we've had some survivors that have said, I remember somebody handing me the phone. I remember getting the warnings, and I just wasn't able to do it then.
Right.
But it was a relief to me to know that there were people out there that cared about me and that were going to offer me a way out.
Right.
And I took that when I could.
I want to go back to the stats with the homicides, because that is actual homicide, to where there's a lot of non-fatal, whether it be gunshots, stab wounds, whatever it may be, that happen to domestic violence victims as well. How do you train your officers, or how do you ensure that they are trained domestic violence specific?
Domestic violence specific, that's something that you get in the academy. Oftentimes in service, that will also be brought up. We've allowed some domestic violence organizations to come into our stations and present and train at roll call. We've also allowed some videos. We also post a lot of domestic violence training on our intranet where all officers have access to, where you can sign up, and it's usually free training. In addition to that, Rosebrooks brought someone in, and maybe even another organization, so if it was you too, because we've done it a couple times, where we've trained officers when you enter homes, you're looking at the pet, because people use, because you know how much we love our pets. Sometimes your abuser will use your pet against you. I'm telling you something you guys already know, but for those listening, like sometimes people will use that as a punishment or a bargaining, or I'll hurt the animal if you leave me.
Right.
So that's something that our officers have yet another layer of training to look for when we go into these situations.
Animal abuse is often the first step in moving, and then it moves into abusing the people, the children, the partner. But if you see animal abuse, then your red flags are definitely going up that you have a potential abuser. It's definitely a red flag, and I'm very glad that most of the programs that I'm aware of around here, we all provide some sort of service for animals, so that can be a part of their leaving. They don't have to leave their animals. I know that a couple of them have shelters, separate pet shelters, but like we're able to take animals on site. Rosebrooks, a safe home, I think all of them are able to do that, because that's key. That's absolute key, because those animals are part of your family. That's just part of them.
Yeah, I think I remember hearing about Hope House coming on board with. I'm so thankful for that, because that will keep people in a dangerous situation because they're not going to abandon their pet.
That's right. What we often see is the trigger to someone actually leaving is either something has been done to the children or to the pets, and that can be that trigger where you find the person saying, okay, I've heard it so many times where someone said, you can beat me, but you're not going to beat my children.
Yes.
You're not going to beat the pets. You're not going to hurt the pets. So if that's their line and that gets crossed, then we have resources then that are available for them. I just was learning, I was excited that at Citizens Academy, we had 2 of our Spanish-speaking staff came and did the Citizens Academy training, and they did it in Spanish just recently. And I was so excited about that. We really have noticed in our Independence location just an increase in Spanish-speaking people and the needs there. So our staff have been able to kind of concentrate and really start to make sure that people in the community know that we have services available. But I was excited to hear that they were able to come and do that in Spanish, so reaching a whole new group of people that we hadn't been able to reach before. So thank you for allowing that partnership to happen.
Funny the timing on that. Our Citizens Police Academy is graduating tonight.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Oh, wow.
And the stat for Spanish-speaking students in Independence is 40% now. And I had no idea it was that large.
I would have never guessed it was that large. That's good.
Very interesting.
That we're in all kinds of different spaces.
Right. And so many of our localities bump up to Kansas City. So I think at times people are like, you don't really do anything with Kansas City. But we really do, because we connect on so many different levels. And I love that partnership. The partnership of having law enforcement bring clients to us, helping with orders of protection, just really making sure that people's needs are getting met. I think often people lose sight of what all is asked of you, that you, as you said earlier, it's not just all law enforcement kind, where you're arresting people.
No, in
There's
fact, that's
so
the
much
smallest
more.
Part.
Right, so much more that goes into it.
How would you like to see your officers work on domestic violence prevention out on the field? Because I know officers will respond to the incident, and they're trained to respond to an incident. Is there any kind of technique that you would like to trial or see if it can help in the domestic violence space?
Well, when you asked me that question, I was thinking of another training that we were afforded, and that was strangulation training. I didn't mean to jump to another reactionary response instead of prevention. prevention, but I do remember that that's an intervention piece. If someone says they were choked, okay, were you strangled? We had a nurse come in and provide that training. But as far as prevention-wise, when you see disturbances where officers are called and it's between parties that are in a domestic violence relationship, I do know that we do go into some of those situations and mediate, try to say, hey, let's just cool off for the night. Maybe you should stay somewhere else so it doesn't escalate to violence. I'd like to see if there's more training out there that would be in the prevention space of us on scene. But I do know our officers try to do a good job in trying to separate parties. That, number one, we don't want to get called back there and someone be injured. But if we can help for it to be peaceful the rest of the night and it not escalate to violence, and I do know that that's some of the conversation that we have. Domestic violence calls are actually dangerous for us as well, on either separating parties or taking someone into custody for an assault. Sometimes the victim will oftentimes turn on us, and there's a lot of emotion that's involved in that. So we are careful, and when we do our original academy training, when you're coming up as a recruit, is to be very on guard during some of those situations and make sure we want to separate the parties where there's not like a back and forth argument, but we also have to keep an eye on each other while we're trying to separate parties, just for our own safety and for theirs, where they're not able to get at each other.
Along with those subject lines, I often wonder about secondary trauma. I personally can't imagine being a law enforcement officer and going to all these calls, but I'm wondering, how do you manage that for your officers, for your department?
There's some resiliency training built into our academy curriculum where we are preparing officers for some of the images that they're going to see, some of the calls that they're going to make, some of the horrible things that people do to other humans. So we try to prepare for that. There's certain positions on our police department where you will be exposed to that type of stimulus more often than others. We have scheduled debriefings with psychologists for some positions. In the patrol bureau, where it's our uniform officers that are going out making calls for service, we have our wellness unit where it is 3 retired police officers, and they are really involved in making sure and checking on people. We have a duty summary is what we call it, of all the significant events that happen over 8-hour period. Every 8 hours one of these duty summaries comes out, and in that our wellness unit is looking at what types of situations were people exposed to. Like if there was someone where it was a child death, a child homicide, or something like that, we will look at that situation and provide services. Sometimes there's some things that officers may be involved in that are mandated debriefings with a psychologist. So we really work on that mental support because we know how important that is, and if some of that is left untouched or unchecked, and I don't want to say checked in a bad way, like in a negative way, but like if some of it's not addressed, that could come out in other ways, which could lead to problems at home, no sleeping, just all kinds of sorts of problems. So we want to make sure that our officers are healthy and continue to stay healthy and resilient when they're put into these very situations.
That just makes me think about the numbers of officers, like turnover or hiring officers, because it is such high intensity work and there's so much trauma that you're exposed to on a daily basis. Are you seeing anything around how long people are staying, as officers, or anything in terms of trying to hire? Are you doing anything around that? I don't know if there's anything new or if you're struggling with that.
I can tell you that post-2020, there was a lot of negative sentiments about law enforcement, and because of that, really dug into the psyche of law enforcement officers.
Right.
And we have had people that, once they got their 25 years since then, they were retired. Or we had some people that just left for the private sector. People that are still here and that are still know that this is a noble profession and it's a privilege to serve, but they choose to serve every day. That has been an issue as far as retaining. Also, I would say recruiting, because it's hard to recruit new officers right now, and that's a nationwide problem. And again, I think that goes back to just our current history. We are continuing to put that out, that it is a privilege to serve. This is a noble profession. This is good work. This is a way that you can have a job that you can get paid for that has a purpose. I think this generation coming up is looking for a cause, is looking for a purpose. We give you that.
Right.
You can really feel like you are making an impact in the world by putting on a uniform every day and going out with a heart to serve.
Across the board, people are having trouble. We struggle with hiring people. I think that is a post-2020 for different reasons, I think. But that high intensity, high stress, it's difficult sometimes to find people who have the ability to do that.
Right.
Because I do think it takes a very special person to be in law enforcement. And I do think that the good people, there are a few bad apples as we have seen, but those are few compared to the good that most of the officers are doing. I don't think you get recognized for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And you can find that in the Indian industry.
Exactly.
But we try to weed people like that out ourselves.
Right.
What you work for, it's not easy to attain the badge that we wear on our shirt. So when we do, we take that seriously with honor. And if someone wants to dishonor or disgrace that badge, those amongst the ranks are the first one to try to say, you're not for us. This isn't for you.
Well, I know from our perspective that working with law enforcement is absolutely key to us doing the work that we do. That those partnerships are incredibly important, not only for the response out to those crisis situations, but just in understanding the issue and helping us to address it. We're not going to ever be able to stop it on our own. I've always said that ending domestic violence is a shared responsibility. It doesn't just lie with law enforcement and the DV agencies, but it's everyone's responsibility. But law enforcement is a key partner that we really are very proud to work with and couldn't do it without you guys. So
I appreciate that. And we're thankful that people like you offer the service that you do. You save lives. So we're thankful to have partners such as you. In addition to that, public safety is a frontline 101 basic need for a healthy city. Being at the table for conversations that are even outside law enforcement, but like public safety issues, quality of life issues, your law enforcement or your public safety should be in those conversations to help whatever the question or the need may be, because we see some things that other people don't see. We are literally in the streets of Kansas City. I said this earlier today, so sorry, Maurice. And I keep using this that someone had said to me, is that we're out there at night when everybody's asleep. You know, we see things that people don't see. We can give you a different perspective on things, and that could possibly lead to even better solutions. I just appreciate, recognizing law enforcement or public safety as a basic component of a healthy city.
Domestic violence is definitely a societal issue, and it takes all of society. And I'd like all of us work ourselves out of a job.
I agree.
Wouldn't that be wonderful?
That would be wonderful.
I was going to say, back into like your prevention deal, and I believe that the movement that the chief kind of initiated with the police department and our violent crime approach, which is a citywide approach, brings us all together as a family where everybody works together for the same purpose of protecting people. Let's stop the victimization of people. Let's save victims and make it more victim-centric. But doing that, I believe that it changes the mindset of things, because, in a domestic violence situation, a lot of times people suffer in silence because they believe that they're alone, there's no one that can help them, and they're in the safest spot that they can be in, which is a very violent, dangerous situation. So if they know that they have family people that they can trust, police departments, Hope House, all these different centers, other community members, if they believe that people are truly there to help them and that they can help them, then they'll be more willing to call when the early signs are starting to show up before it gets too violent and starts to really affect the family. So I think the community approach and the all hands on deck and the family approach is a great method in preventing the domestic violence trend, and maybe even then will scare off people from wanting to victimize others, because now they know that there's a consequence, that everyone is going to turn their back on you, go after you for being the bad guy in that position.
Yeah, letting you know that behavior is not tolerated in this community.
Yes.
Right.
And that's key to me. That is absolute key, that people hold the offender accountable, that offender then knows there will be consequences for this behavior. We've come light years in terms of how we used to address domestic violence to how we do it now, but if we don't hold people accountable, then there's no reason for that behavior to stop. Why would you? If it's working for you and you're able to maintain that control and you have everything you want, why would you change it unless there's some sort of consequence? I think that's absolutely key. We all have to do that together. We all have to work together, and you can't.
I like to think that the domestic violence numbers are going up because of conversations and partnerships like this, where people are coming out from their homes and understanding that there are resources, and we're working together to try to combat what we all know is domestic violence.
But I think you talked about those community aspects of how important that is. What I see is that it gives people the chance to see officers in a new way. If you are a young child and the only memory or the only interaction you've had with a police officer is when they're hauling your dad out, that can be a very negative perception then. So if you have other kinds of interactions and you have other ways that you're reaching those people, then they're going to see you as a resource and see you as a way to help them rather than, oh, you're the person who took my dad away. So I think that's key.
And sometimes that's the opposite look for us too. The one entity that came into the room that made it safe for the night when we took Dad away or brought them to a shelter. We've also had people that have told us that as adults, like when I was a kid, I lived in a house with domestic violence, and when we called police and the police would come, I always felt safe.
I remember talking to I don't know what his rank was, but he had an interaction as a child with law enforcement, and that made his decision right then that he was going into law enforcement. And he ended up serving with the person who had responded to his house and said, "You are the reason I'm in law enforcement, because you protected us that night."
That's awesome.
I know, it just gives me chills when I think about that.
Yes,
So
love that.
That's awesome.
That never comes back to us. So sometimes I'll remind some of our academy recruits, especially when they just graduate and they do their traditional run in front of headquarters, like, you don't know the impact that you could have on one person with one contact. They could remember you for good or bad for the rest of their life. So make sure that it's a positive contact that you have with people to bring credit to the badge.
And I think we, at most of the time, hear a lot of the negative things that are happening in the city and the crimes and the violence. And that pales in comparison to the thousands of good things that police officers are doing every single day in our community. And I wish we could highlight that a little bit more. What's a few things that you would want to highlight that are very positive going on in our community right now?
The momentum that Kansas City, Missouri Police Department, our city leaders, social service organizations, neighborhoods, all coming together for this citywide approach to violent crime.
I love being a part of that.
Oh my gosh, it has been wonderful. It's just a synergy in the room. And this isn't a slight to what has been before us. I just don't think that we were as well positioned. And I say we, I'm talking about the city. And I'm not talking about City Hall. I'm talking about everybody in Kansas City.
Society as
I
a
think
city.
we're all on the same page. We all want the same things. We've seen that commonality in each other, and we see that drive. I've also seen the business community come forward and ask how they can be a part of the solution. So I think all of this momentum, we need to seize that opportunity and make sure that it's sustainable to where we can really make a lasting, impactful change of the culture of violence in Kansas City.
Thank you, Sergeant Oatis and Chief Graves, for your time today. We sure appreciate you for coming on.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Illuminating Hope, a podcast of Hope House. A special thank you to our newest recurring donor, Carol. Learn how you can support Hope House and domestic violence survivors by visiting hopehouse.net.